In the sprawling landscape of human history, few individuals have shaped the minds of civilizations quite like one man from ancient China. Picture this: a teacher so revolutionary that his methods would influence billions of students across 25 centuries. A philosopher whose ideas would become the backbone of entire educational systems. A man whose birthday is still celebrated as Teacher's Day across multiple nations today. His name was Kong Qi, but history knows him by another title, Confucius, the teacher of 10,000 generations. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about this story. This wasn't some privileged aristocrat born into power and influence. This was a man whose father died when he was just 3 years old, whose family had fallen from nobility into poverty, and who grew up in what was essentially a war-torn, chaotic period of Chinese history. Yet somehow, from these humble beginnings, he would create an educational revolution that would transform not just China, but eventually Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and beyond. Now, you might be wondering, what made this one teacher so special that his influence would span millennia? What did he do differently that earned him the title Teacher of 10,000 Generations? And why, in our modern age of technology and innovation, are educators and philosophers still studying his methods? Well, I'm about to reveal how Confucius didn't just teach students, he fundamentally reimagined what education could be. He broke barriers that had stood for centuries, democratized learning in ways that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era, and developed teaching techniques so effective that they're still being used in classrooms around the world today. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this ancient Chinese philosopher remains the most influential educator in human history. But first, let me paint you a picture of the world Confucius was born into, because without understanding this context, you can't fully appreciate the magnitude of what he accomplished. The year was 551 BCE, and China was fragmenting. The once mighty Zhou dynasty was collapsing, and the land was divided into warring states locked in constant conflict. This period, known as the Spring and Autumn era, was marked by political chaos, social upheaval, and the breakdown of traditional order. Imagine trying to build an educational philosophy in the middle of a civilization that was literally falling apart around you. Into this turbulent world was born Kong Qi in the state of Lu, in what is now Shandong province. His family name, Kong, would eventually become synonymous with wisdom itself. But at the time of his birth, the Kong family was struggling. They were descendants of nobility who had fallen on hard times, reduced to what we might call the lower middle class of ancient Chinese society. When Confucius was just 3 years old, his father died, leaving his mother to raise him alone. This single event would shape everything about his future philosophy. Growing up without a father, in a society where patriarchal authority was supreme, gave him a unique perspective on family relationships, social bonds, and the importance of moral guidance. It also meant he experienced firsthand the struggles of those who weren't born into privilege. As a young man, Confucius worked various jobs to support his family. He was a bookkeeper, a caretaker of livestock, and even supervised granaries. These weren't glamorous positions, but they gave him something invaluable: direct contact with people from all walks of life. He saw how merchants struggled, how farmers worked the land, how government officials made decisions that affected ordinary people. This grassroots experience would later inform his revolutionary approach to education. Now, here's where the story gets fascinating. In ancient China, education was exclusively the privilege of the aristocratic elite. If you weren't born into nobility, you simply didn't get educated. Knowledge was hoarded by the ruling class as a tool to maintain power. The idea that a farmer's son or a merchant's child could learn to read, write, or study philosophy was almost unthinkable. But Confucius looked at this system and said, essentially, this is completely wrong. He became the first teacher in Chinese history to advocate for what he called teaching without discrimination. This wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was a revolutionary manifesto that would shake the foundations of Chinese society. Think about how radical this was. Confucius was essentially declaring that intelligence, wisdom, and moral character weren't determined by birth, but by effort and education. He was saying that a poor farmer's son could become just as wise and capable as a prince, given the right instruction. This was democracy in education centuries before democracy existed in politics. And he didn't just talk about this philosophy, he lived it. Confucius opened his doors to students from every conceivable background. Nobles and commoners studied side by side. Former criminals sat next to sons of government ministers. He even accepted students who couldn't afford to pay traditional fees, sometimes accepting nothing more than a bundle of dried meat as tuition. The results were extraordinary. Over his lifetime, Confucius taught more than 3,000 students. But here's what makes this even more impressive. It wasn't just about the numbers. According to historical records, 72 of his students achieved complete mastery of what he taught, becoming accomplished scholars and leaders in their own right. These weren't just graduates. They were disciples who would carry forward his teachings and establish schools of their own. Among these legendary 72 disciples were some truly remarkable individuals. There was Yan Hui, Confucius's favorite student, who came from such a poor family that he lived in a shabby neighborhood, surviving on a bowl of millet and a ladle of water each day. Yet his dedication to learning was so profound that when he died young, Confucius wept openly, saying, "If not for this man, for whom should I show so much sorrow?" Then there was Tantai Miming, whose story reveals something beautiful about Confucius's character. When Tantai first came to study, Confucius initially judged him poorly because of his extremely unattractive appearance. But after Tantai completed his studies, he traveled south and eventually attracted 300 students of his own, becoming a renowned teacher himself. When Confucius heard of his success, he publicly admitted his mistake, confessing that he had been wrong to judge based on appearances alone. This story illustrates something crucial about Confucian education. It wasn't just about transferring knowledge from teacher to student. It was about personal growth, humility, and the recognition that everyone, including the teacher, had room for improvement. But how exactly did Confucius teach? What made his methods so effective that they would influence education for over 2 millennia? This is where his genius really becomes apparent. First, he developed what we would now call a holistic curriculum. He didn't just focus on one subject area. Instead, he created a comprehensive educational program called the 6 Arts. These included ritual and ceremony, music, archery, chariot driving, calligraphy, and mathematics. This wasn't random. Each area served a specific purpose in developing a complete human being. The ritual and ceremony taught respect for tradition and social harmony. Music developed emotional intelligence and cultural refinement. Archery and chariot driving built physical discipline and practical skills. Calligraphy enhanced both artistic ability and precise thinking. Mathematics sharpened logical reasoning. Together, these 6 arts created what we might today call a liberal arts education, one designed to develop the whole person, not just their professional skills. Second, Confucius pioneered what modern educators call differentiated instruction. He famously said that a teacher should only point out one corner of a square. It was up to the student to come back with the other 3. This meant that rather than simply lecturing and expecting passive absorption, he engaged students in active learning, encouraging them to think, question, and discover. Even more remarkably, he adapted his teaching to each individual student's personality and learning style. Readers of the Analects, the collection of his sayings and conversations, are always struck by how differently he spoke to different disciples. With some, he was gentle and encouraging. With others, he was challenging and demanding. He understood that one size definitely did not fit all when it came to education. This personalized approach was revolutionary. Confucius recognized that students came to him with different backgrounds, abilities, and motivations. Some were naturally quick learners who needed to be pushed harder. Others required patient encouragement to build confidence. Some learned best through discussion and debate, while others preferred quiet reflection and study. What's truly remarkable is that Confucius didn't just adapt to his students' learning styles. He actually studied them. He would observe how each disciple responded to different types of instruction, what motivated them, what frustrated them, and what brought out their best thinking. This wasn't casual observation either. He kept detailed mental notes about each student's progress, their strengths, their weaknesses, and their potential. Take his approach with different personality types. When dealing with impulsive students who acted before thinking, he would deliberately slow them down with complex philosophical questions that required careful consideration. But when he had overly cautious students who hesitated to take action, he would push them to make quick decisions and trust their instincts. He understood that education wasn't about creating identical copies of himself, but about helping each person become the best version of themselves. This individualized teaching created something unprecedented in the ancient world, a classroom environment where students felt genuinely known and valued. They weren't just anonymous faces in a crowd. Each disciple understood that their teacher saw their unique potential and was committed to helping them achieve it. This personal investment created incredibly strong bonds of loyalty and motivation. But here's where Confucius's teaching methods get really sophisticated. He didn't believe in simply telling students what to think. Instead, he mastered the art of asking the right questions at the right time. He would present moral dilemmas, historical examples, or philosophical puzzles, then guide his students through the process of working out solutions themselves. For instance, rather than lecturing about the importance of honesty, he might tell a story about a government official faced with a choice between protecting his family and telling the truth to his ruler. Then he would ask his students what they would do in that situation and why. This approach forced them to grapple with real ethical challenges and develop their own moral reasoning skills. The conversations recorded in the Analects show this technique in action again and again. A student would approach with a question about governance, and Confucius would respond with another question that made them examine their assumptions. Someone would ask about the nature of wisdom, and he would challenge them to define what they meant by wisdom in the first place. This Socratic method, asking questions to stimulate critical thinking rather than simply providing answers, was so effective that it spread throughout Chinese intellectual culture. Centuries later, it would influence educational practices across East Asia and eventually make its way into Western pedagogical theory. But Confucius took this questioning approach even further. He encouraged his students to challenge him as well. Unlike many teachers of his era who demanded absolute deference, he welcomed debate and discussion. He wanted his disciples to develop independent thinking skills, not become mindless followers. This created classroom dynamics that were electric with intellectual energy. Students would engage in spirited debates about moral principles, political theory, and social reform. Confucius would moderate these discussions, occasionally offering insights or redirecting the conversation, but always encouraging his disciples to think for themselves. The impact of this approach was profound. His students didn't just memorize his teachings, they internalized the process of critical thinking itself. They learned how to analyze complex problems, consider multiple perspectives, and arrive at reasoned conclusions. These skills served them throughout their lives, whether they became government officials, teachers, or community leaders. Now, you might be wondering how Confucius managed to create such an effective learning environment with such a diverse group of students. After all, he was bringing together people from completely different social backgrounds, with varying levels of prior education and radically different life experiences. How do you create unity and purpose in such a mixed group? His solution was brilliant. He established what we might call a learning community, built around shared values rather than shared background. While his students came from different social classes, they all committed to the same fundamental principles: the pursuit of wisdom, the development of moral character, and the desire to contribute positively to society. This shared commitment created powerful bonds among the disciples. The nobleman's son and the former criminal found common ground in their dedication to learning. The wealthy merchant's child and the poor farmer's son developed mutual respect based on their intellectual achievements rather than their family wealth. Confucius reinforced this sense of community through regular group activities. He organized discussions where students could share insights from their studies. He arranged cultural events where they could practice music and poetry together. He even took them on educational journeys to historical sites and neighboring states, where they could observe different forms of government and social organization. These shared experiences created what modern educators would recognize as a powerful peer learning network. Students learned as much from each other as they did from their master. The more advanced disciples helped teach the newer ones, while fresh perspectives from recent arrivals challenged everyone to think differently. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Confucius's teaching was his emphasis on moral education alongside intellectual development. In his era, most education focused purely on practical skills: reading, writing, mathematics, military training. The idea that schools should also develop character and ethical reasoning was almost unheard of. Confucius argued that knowledge without moral grounding was not just useless, but potentially dangerous. A brilliant person who lacked ethical principles could cause tremendous harm to society. Therefore, every aspect of his curriculum was designed to develop both intellectual capabilities and moral character simultaneously. This integration of ethics and academics created a new type of educated person, what Confucius called the Junzi, often translated as gentleman or exemplary person. The Junzi wasn't defined by birth or wealth, but by their combination of knowledge, wisdom, and moral integrity. This became the ideal that Chinese education would pursue for the next 2 millennia. The practical impact of this approach was extraordinary. Confucian-educated individuals became known throughout ancient China for their reliability, their ethical standards, and their commitment to public service. Government officials who had studied under Confucian teachers were trusted to handle important responsibilities because their education had emphasized character development as much as administrative skills. This reputation for producing ethical leaders gave Confucian education enormous prestige and influence. Rulers began seeking out Confucian-trained officials for key government positions. Wealthy families started sending their children to study under Confucian teachers, not just for the knowledge they would gain, but for the moral foundation they would develop. As word of these remarkable educational outcomes spread, something unprecedented began to happen. Other teachers started adopting Confucian methods. Students who had completed their studies under Confucius began establishing their own schools, carrying forward his techniques and principles. What had started as one man's revolutionary approach to education began to multiply and spread throughout Chinese society. The transformation was gradual but profound. Within a few generations, the exclusive aristocratic control over education began to weaken. Merit-based advancement became more common in government service. Social mobility increased, as talented individuals from humble backgrounds could rise through educational achievement rather than noble birth. This educational revolution had ripple effects that extended far beyond the classroom. As more people gained access to learning, literacy rates increased. As ethical education became more widespread, social cohesion improved. As critical thinking skills spread throughout the population, innovations in technology, governance, and culture began to accelerate. But here's where the story takes an even more fascinating turn. Confucius didn't just revolutionize how people learned, he fundamentally changed what it meant to be a teacher. Before him, teachers were essentially information deliverers, people who possessed knowledge and transferred it to those wealthy enough to afford it. Confucius transformed teaching into something much more profound, a sacred relationship between mentor and disciple that could change both lives forever. Consider how he approached the relationship with his students. He didn't position himself as an untouchable authority figure dispensing wisdom from on high. Instead, he saw himself as a fellow learner, someone who was further along the path but still growing and discovering. This humility wasn't weakness, was revolutionary strength that allowed him to connect with his disciples in ways that traditional teachers never could. His famous declaration that I am not one who was born with knowledge wasn't false modesty, it was a teaching tool. By admitting his own limitations and ongoing learning process, he gave his students permission to struggle, to make mistakes, and to grow. This created a classroom atmosphere where intellectual risk-taking was encouraged rather than punished. But what really set Confucius apart was his ability to see potential where others saw nothing. Remember Tantai Miming, the student he initially dismissed because of his appearance? That story reveals something extraordinary about Confucian education. He developed what we might call a growth mindset centuries before the term existed. He believed that human nature was fundamentally malleable, that intelligence could be developed, and that character could be cultivated through proper guidance and effort. This belief in human potential led him to take on students that other teachers would have rejected outright. Former criminals, social outcasts, individuals with learning difficulties, Confucius saw them all as raw material that could be shaped into something remarkable with the right approach. His student body looked like a social experiment that shouldn't have worked, yet somehow produced extraordinary results. The key was his teaching philosophy centered on what he called Ren, often translated as humanness or benevolence, but really meaning something much deeper. Ren was about recognizing the fundamental interconnectedness of all human beings, the idea that we rise or fall together as a community. This wasn't just abstract philosophy. It became the practical foundation for everything he taught. When his students studied mathematics, they weren't just learning to calculate, they were developing the precision of thought needed to make fair judgments that would benefit society. When they practiced archery, they weren't just building physical skill, they were learning focus, discipline, and the importance of consistent effort toward a worthy goal. When they studied music, they weren't just developing artistic appreciation, they were training their emotional intelligence and their ability to create harmony with others. This integration of practical skills with moral development created what we might call the first truly holistic education system. Every lesson had multiple layers of meaning. Every activity served several purposes simultaneously. Students weren't just acquiring knowledge, they were being transformed into more complete human beings. The results spoke for themselves. His disciples didn't just become successful, they became leaders who were known for their integrity, their wisdom, and their ability to bring out the best in others. They went on to serve in government positions where they implemented reforms that improved millions of lives. They established schools that educated countless future generations. They became the kind of people who made society better by their very presence. Take Yan Hui, his favorite disciple, whose dedication to learning was so complete that he willingly lived in poverty rather than compromise his studies. Yan Hui embodied the Confucian ideal of the scholar who pursues wisdom not for personal gain, but because knowledge and moral development are inherently valuable. His example inspired countless students across the centuries to prioritize learning over material success. Or consider Xilu, another prominent disciple, who was initially impulsive and quick to anger. Under Confucius's guidance, he learned to channel his passion into constructive action, becoming a skilled administrator known for his courage and loyalty. This transformation from hot-headed youth to respected leader demonstrated the power of Confucian education to reshape personality itself. These success stories weren't accidents or coincidences. They were the predictable outcomes of an educational system that had been carefully designed to develop human potential. Confucius had cracked the code of effective teaching by focusing not just on what students needed to know, but on who they needed to become. His teaching methods became so refined that they bordered on art. He developed an intuitive sense for exactly when to challenge a student and when to offer support. He knew when to let someone struggle through a problem alone and when to provide gentle guidance. He understood the delicate balance between pushing students beyond their comfort zones and not overwhelming them with impossibly difficult tasks. This sensitivity to individual learning needs created something unprecedented in the ancient world: truly personalized education. While modern educators talk about differentiating instruction, Confucius was actually doing it over 2,500 years ago. He had different conversations with different students about the same topics, because he understood that each person needed to approach wisdom from their own unique angle. But perhaps his most remarkable innovation was his approach to failure and mistakes. In most ancient educational systems, errors were punished harshly. Students lived in fear of getting something wrong. Confucius turned this completely upside down by treating mistakes as valuable learning opportunities rather than shameful failures. When a student made an error in reasoning or judgment, Confucius would explore it with them, helping them understand not just what they had gotten wrong, but why they had made that particular mistake. This process helped students develop self-awareness and metacognitive skills, the ability to think about their own thinking. They learned to monitor their own learning process and make adjustments when they realized they were going off track. This approach to mistakes created a classroom culture where intellectual honesty was prized above appearing smart. Students felt safe to express uncertainty, to ask questions that might seem obvious, and to admit when they didn't understand something. This psychological safety is now recognized by modern educational research as one of the most important factors in effective learning environments. The ripple effects of this teaching philosophy extended far beyond his immediate students. As his disciples went out into the world and became teachers themselves, they carried forward not just his ideas, but his methods. They created their own schools that operated on Confucian principles, multiplying his impact exponentially. Within a few generations, a network of Confucian schools had spread throughout China. These weren't just institutions that taught Confucian philosophy. They were schools that used Confucian teaching methods. They emphasized moral development alongside academic achievement. They welcomed students from diverse backgrounds. They focused on developing critical thinking rather than rote memorization. They treated teaching as a sacred calling rather than just a job. This educational revolution began to transform Chinese society from the ground up. The old system, based purely on hereditary privilege, started giving way to a more merit-based approach. Government positions that had once been reserved for nobility began opening up to anyone who could demonstrate the knowledge and character developed through education. The imperial examination system that would later govern Chinese civil service for over 1,000 years had its roots in these Confucian innovations. The idea that government officials should be selected based on their education and moral character rather than their birth or wealth was a direct descendant of Confucian teaching philosophy. But the influence didn't stop at China's borders. As Chinese culture spread to neighboring countries, Confucian educational ideas traveled with it. Korean scholars adapted his methods to their own cultural context. Japanese educators incorporated his principles into their teaching approaches. Vietnamese schools developed their own versions of Confucian pedagogy. Each culture that encountered Confucian education modified it to fit their own needs and values. But the core principles remained consistent. Education should be accessible to all, teaching should be personalized to individual needs, moral development should accompany intellectual growth, and learning should be an active, engaging process rather than passive absorption of information. What's truly remarkable is how these ancient teaching methods have proven to be remarkably durable and effective. Modern educational research has validated many of Confucian innovations that seemed revolutionary 2,500 years ago. His emphasis on personalized instruction aligns with contemporary understanding of differentiated learning. His focus on questioning and critical thinking mirrors what we now call inquiry-based education. His integration of moral and intellectual development reflects current interest in social-emotional learning. The countries that have most faithfully preserved Confucian educational traditions, places like South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, consistently rank among the top performers in international educational assessments. This isn't coincidence. It's evidence that Confucian teaching methods continue to produce remarkable results even in our modern, technology-driven world. Consider how Confucian values still shape educational culture in East Asia today. The profound respect for teachers, the emphasis on hard work and persistence, the belief that education is the key to both personal development and social progress, add these ideas trace directly back to Confucius's original insights about the nature of learning and teaching. The title Teacher of 10,000 Generations isn't hyperbole. It's a recognition that his influence on education has been both profound and enduring. From ancient Chinese academies to modern international schools, from traditional Confucian texts to cutting-edge pedagogical research, his fingerprints can be found on virtually every aspect of how we think about effective teaching and learning. But what makes this legacy even more impressive is that it wasn't built on force or political power. Confucius never held high government office. He never commanded armies or controlled vast wealth. His influence spread purely through the power of his ideas and the effectiveness of his methods. Students came to him voluntarily, learned from him eagerly, and then carried his teachings forward, because they had experienced firsthand how transformative his approach could be. This organic spread of educational innovation demonstrates something profound about human nature. When people encounter truly effective teaching, they recognize it instinctively. They want to learn more, and they want to share what they've learned with others. Confucian education succeeded because it worked. And it worked because it was based on deep insights into how human beings actually learn and grow. The story of how one teacher from ancient China became the most influential educator in human history isn't just about the past. It's about the enduring power of great teaching to change lives and transform societies. In our modern age of educational challenges and opportunities, perhaps it's time we looked back to learn from the master teacher who showed us that education isn't just about transferring information, but about developing human potential in all its magnificent complexity. The genius of Confucius becomes even more apparent when we examine his most revolutionary educational principle, the concept that knowledge must be earned, not simply received. Unlike other teachers of his era who would lecture for hours while students sat passively, Confucius created what we might recognize today as the world's first truly interactive classroom. Picture this scene. A group of disciples gathered under a tree, engaged in heated debate about the nature of justice. One student argues that justice means following the law exactly as written. Another counters that true justice requires understanding the spirit behind the law. A third suggests that justice must be tempered with mercy. And there, in the middle of it all, sits Confucius, not providing answers, but asking the questions that push each student to examine their assumptions more deeply. This wasn't chaos. It was carefully orchestrated intellectual development. Confucius understood something that modern neuroscience has confirmed. The brain learns best when it's actively engaged in constructing knowledge rather than passively absorbing it. He turned his students into intellectual detectives, challenging them to investigate moral and philosophical problems rather than simply accepting predetermined solutions. But here's where his approach gets truly sophisticated. Confucius didn't just encourage debate, he taught his students how to disagree productively. In an age when intellectual disagreement often led to personal hostility, he created ground rules for respectful discourse that allowed opposing viewpoints to coexist and even strengthen each other through dialogue. His disciples learned to attack ideas without attacking people, to find common ground even in fundamental disagreements, and to change their minds when presented with compelling evidence. These skills proved invaluable when they later became government officials, community leaders, and teachers themselves. They could navigate complex political situations, build coalitions across different factions, and solve problems through collaboration rather than confrontation. The transformation this created in Chinese intellectual culture was profound. Before Confucius, scholarly discussion was largely confined to small circles of aristocratic elites who shared similar backgrounds and perspectives. His approach democratized not just access to education, but the very process of knowledge creation itself. Ideas were no longer evaluated based on who proposed them, but on their merit and logical consistency. This shift had cascading effects throughout society. As Confucian-educated individuals moved into positions of influence, they brought with them a culture of reasoned deliberation and evidence-based decision-making. Government policies began to be debated more thoroughly. Administrative decisions were subjected to greater scrutiny. Even military strategies were examined through multiple perspectives before implementation. What's remarkable is how Confucius managed to balance this intellectual rigor with genuine human warmth and compassion. His teaching wasn't cold, clinical analysis. It was passionate engagement with the deepest questions of human existence. He taught his students to care deeply about ideas, while maintaining objectivity about their own beliefs. From a humble beginning in ancient China to classrooms around the world today, Confucius proved that one teacher with revolutionary ideas can reshape civilization itself. His legacy lives on. Every time a student questions rather than simply accepts, every time education opens doors regardless of social status, and every time moral character is valued alongside academic achievement. The teacher of 10,000 generations reminds us that great education isn't just about what we learn, it's about who we become.